I'm Allison Sigelka, and I head up product at Cloudsmith, and I'll be moderating today's session. I've got some excellent guests joining me today who are going to share the insights and learnings they've had as they've journeyed through what it means to have a secure software supply chain. We'll talk about specific approaches they've seen teams take to prioritize implementation of software supply chain best practices, how organizations can balance the freedom and autonomy of developers with the need for security, and talk a little bit about where the industry is at with embracing standards and best practices in this space. And with that, I'd like to bring up our guests. We have Peter Wagner, Staff Infrastructure Security Developer at Shopify, Kim Lewandowski, a software supply chain security expert and co-founder of Chainguard. Prior to her role at Chainguard, she was program manager at Google on the open source software security team, where she co-founded the Salsa framework. We also have Jerome Hardaway, founder and executive director of Vetsu Code, senior software engineer at Microsoft, and CTO of MyRuck AI. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for having us.
To get started, I was hoping each of you could tell us a little bit more about your background and share how you became interested in software supply chain and security best practices. Kim, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Yeah, so I have quite a story. I think my career's gone kind of full circle. I have a CS degree where I concentrated on security in college, and then went off to be an engineer for several years. I worked at a nuclear research lab right out of school, and then I went into the startup world, and then I landed at Google working as a product manager on Google Cloud. And that's where I started doing more work in the open source, so building CI/CD tooling, which naturally led to then security stuff. So I was helping protect Google from risk of open source security, and then decided to go out on my own again and start a company with a number of other folks where we focused strictly on software supply chain security. So started security, went out of it, and now I'm back.
Great. Jerome, how about you? Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your interest in software supply chain and security best practices generally?
Roger that. So, sorry. I'm prior Air Force before getting into the tech side, and with the nonprofit Vetsu Code, I'm always looking for roles that have great synergy with people who have prior military experience. And this role spoke to me because there was a lot of things, this part of this component spoke to me because there are a lot of things in it that are very similar to things I did in the military on the security side with security forces, particularly when you're in the BDoc. And I was like, oh, this has some, one-to-one, connections, and this might be a great opportunity for me to help other veterans learn, about tech and other approach. So that was what really got me into the software security side of things.
Great. And Peter, how about you?
Pretty similar story. A tour of lots of startups where I was the build expert on the software development team, which pivoted into being, I guess I'm a build expert now. Coupled with lots of security work, a little bit of cryptography. And if you're at the intersection of build security and cryptography, you're pretty much in the supply chain software security space. So that's how I wound up here.
Okay, great. Thank you all for sharing. So a wide range of experience and in this space for a while. I'm curious how you've seen the conversation change around software supply chain security in the last 18 months or 2 years. So, how has it come into focus for organizations, and how has the conversation changed in the past few years? Who wants to jump in?
Sure, I
can certainly start.
Go ahead, Peter. Just from my perspective, it was interesting. Like I said, I switched to back to the security space. Man, I can't do time anymore. 3 or 4 years ago, I guess, roughly. And we sort of knew about supply chain security, or what we dubbed as supply chain security. And then, of course, the infamous SolarWinds incident happened, the sunburst thing. And that's what really felt like it flipped the industry on its head, where everyone was starting to pay attention now. So I think just the awareness in the space has like ballooned over the last few years, that people now, like, you see software supply chain security everywhere. If you go to a security conference, a lot of companies are tackling this space. A lot of people are talking about it. And I think now that, you know, there's a general awareness about the problem space, now we're starting to see like companies wanting to start putting plans together to tackle it head on. That's what I've noticed.
I think the emergence of standards is also a big thing in the last 18 months. Previously, I would give you an SBOM, but it was just like a text file that had a bunch of packages in it. Now there's actually an SBOM format that I can send, you can understand. That's really a big win. As well as SigStore being adopted absolutely everywhere. I think 18 months ago, I might see a container security product being signed by SigStore. Recently, I was just grabbing a Prometheus exporter, and it was signed from a GitHub Actions worker, pushed to a registry. The fact that it's not just security people that are doing this, it's the rest of the ecosystem, that seems to be happening, and that has me very excited for the next 18 months.
Yes, I was going to say that. It's very, our community, our industry is very unique, where people don't care about certain things until it starts impacting the revenue line. And that's kind of what happened with the software security supply chain work, is that no one, you know, it was not really a big deal. It wasn't really on people's radar. And then SolarWind happened and a few other things down the pipeline happened. And suddenly, oh, well, we have, now this is something that we need to focus on. And, you know, it's just, you know, I put it right up there with accessibility and several other things that, oh, it's important after someone loses like a couple $1 billion. That's when it became a thing. So I totally agree with Kim.
Yeah. So, Peter, I'm glad you brought up standards. I'd be curious, within the organizations, either your organization or the organizations you've been working with, what are the standards and what are the best practices that organizations are starting to adopt?
So we flipped a coin basically on our SBOM standard. We ended up with CycloneDX as we liked the included vulnerability information. And then SigStore attestations, I believe the in toto format, are the other thing that we're leveraging and seeing a lot of usage around. So those are the two standards I think we tie the most to. CycloneDX for SBOMs and in toto attestations.
Great.
Yeah, I could take a stab. Yeah, there's a bunch of new standards out there, as Peter mentioned, SBOMs. I don't know if folks on the call or even what the familiarity is, but basically think about them as like the list of software, or the ingredient list, as folks refer to them as. So it's basically like everything that's within a piece of software, because software depends on a lot of other software. So it's listing all of those things out. It is something that the government is starting to mandate for certain organizations to provide. If they want to sell to the federal government, you need to include an SBOM. So this is sort of an up and coming thing that we're seeing. There's a few different formats out there. Peter spoke to CycloneDX, and there's another one, SPDX. That's basically, yeah, just different standards around the SBOM thing. And then another one Peter mentioned, the SigStore project. This is for code signing. So to be able to put a stamp that says this code was indeed written for me or was built by this build system. It's authenticating where code came from. And then there's a few other standards. I worked on a framework called Salsa when I was at Google, SLSA. It's not a formal standard yet, but it's a set of best practices for supply chain security. And then there's probably others that I'm missing. There's a bunch of new standards in this space right now that people are all just trying to do the right thing and kind of push the needle forward. So
I think for me, the biggest standard, the biggest thing that's become standard that I like is the education and training of personnel on all levels. We've started to treat this component as, you know, everybody is everybody's a possible leak in the program. Everybody has everybody is responsible for the security, the software security supply chain now. So you have everyone getting educated, everyone being trained, versus, you know, they used to even now when you see some companies, they kind of silo them into a department, but now you know, people are moving away from that, and they're like, on some level, everyone needs to know this stuff, or everyone needs to know this stuff on a level that they can understand that they impact, right? It's a very much a zero trust protocol that's been implemented, and I can really appreciate that being the direction that things are going.
Yeah, so I'm really interested to dig in a little bit on SBOMs, and you also brought up signing, Peter, which is great. I think for Cloudsmith, probably 2 years ago, we were talking about SBOMs with our customers. They weren't really bringing it to us, but that's shifted a little bit in the past 12 to 6 months. But I think there's still this question of, well, what do I do with this SBOM now that I have it? So like, what are the actual practices and ways that I leverage this SBOM to secure my software supply chain? Kim, you mentioned, governments requiring it, but for folks who aren't selling to government, what does the SBOM do for them, and how should they be leveraging that? And I'd be curious for this group's insights or practices that your organizations are implementing around that.
I can go first. So we built a pipeline to index all the SBOMs for everything running in our Kubernetes clusters. So when there's a deployment event, we pull in the SBOM, store that in a database, and then we end up with a big dependency graph of what version of OpenSSL is running in what cluster. We have a GraphQL interface for querying that. So the pattern I think people would want to follow is take all of your SBOMs and store them in some central storage that's easier for you to index than having 15 different disconnected SBOMs for your 15 different containers. Some kind of combination index is going to increase the amount of value you get instead of needing to fetch an individual SBOM every time you want to know what's running. Yeah,
so Peter, it sounds like within Shopify, it's that having that database that you can then go and query when you need to know where a specific piece of software is running.
Yep, absolutely. You can think of it like GitHub's dependency graph, but with a little bit better visibility, because we're scanning into containers, whereas GitHub's only looking at lock files in the source code repository.
Kim or Jerome, have you seen organizations implement actual practices around those SBOMs and leveraging them to secure the software supply chain?
Yeah, we definitely have. I think just going back a little bit, I think one of the huge gaps in the industry today and in the space is organizations just don't know what they're running in their production environment. So if they're running Kubernetes, they have no idea what's in there, what packages they're actually pulling in. Similarly to developers just pulling, open source software, any software kind of to use in their production environments, they don't know what's going into it, where the source code even came from, like what developers are writing code in it. So this is one of the areas where I think SBOM starts to help the situation. Is it's giving you that picture, if they're accurate, of course. It's giving you that picture of what is the software in this other piece of software that I'm depending on. So I think it goes a long way of just having that general awareness of what the heck you're running in your production systems. And one of the ways that we see it being used and are helping organizations use it is part of like the vulnerability piece. So vulnerability management is just a huge pain. It's a ton of effort, a ton of resources that go into trying to make sure all your software is free from vulnerabilities in your production system. So when you have that complete picture of everything that's running, you can start actually tracking and understanding the risk involved when it comes to like the vulnerabilities. So an SBOMs can be helpful in that way to let you know what you're running and what you need to do to fix it.
Yeah, definitely.
Raj, so first, before we go any further, because there might be people who are new to this stuff, I believe SBOM means software bill of materials, right? Like that's what it means. So like let's make sure we I just want to make sure we put the definition out there. There's somebody that's interested in this stuff but doesn't know what we're talking about, because we just dropped SBOM like 45 times and like, no one explained what it is. So I think when it comes to SBOMs, Kim, she said it has to be updated. Like that's the most important thing. The technologists tend to be bad with any form of documentation. So we tend to, this is the SBOM from 6 months to 18 months ago. Like, oh, well, is this accurate now? Nah. Oh, okay. So that's the first step. for me, when I've seen in the practices at Microsoft, we're starting to implement this type of practice very early onto before we build a thing, right? This is like within the first 2 weeks, we're sitting down and we're talking about the things that we need to ensure that the supply chain of the software is accurate and up to date. And every week we're reviewing that SBOM and ensuring like that, along with everything else, is are the tools we need, are the tools we are still using, implementing, trying to put into production. So I think with these type of practices, things are being implemented earlier and earlier, and many, especially in larger companies where they might be doing a lot of R&D like stuff, versus smaller companies where the project is legacy and they have to work their way backwards through some of these things. But that's just what I've been noticing in the industry for the past, at least for the past year and a half.
Yeah, Jerome, thank you so much for making sure we said what software SBOM stood for there. You bring up an interesting point. I think you had mentioned there's some project playbooks within Microsoft. I'm curious a little bit across the group within your organizations or the organizations you support, who have you seen as being responsible for software supply chain initiatives and best practices and making sure they're getting implemented?
I know at Microsoft, everyone is responsible. So, like I said, we have a very zero trust protocol on everything. So everyone is responsible. Like from the software engineer one all the way to the principals. So that's where we don't really silo it to like this person is a specialist type thing. We want everyone to understand these things because, especially if you're on a team of 5, right? Let's say that specialist takes time off. Now you don't have that skill set. While there are people that are stronger than in other areas, with everyone, everyone has a baseline, and we're very, very heavy on documenting and making sure that people follow those, as you said, those playbooks and things of those things. We even open sourced a few of them so other people can follow and adopt them into their orgs. So that's what I've been seeing.
Peter, what does that look like at Shopify?
I think we're maybe a little bit more hierarchical. The security team tries to own the entire from code to deployment pipeline, but we recognize that there are people that know more about Ruby gems and Ruby gem dependency management than the security team does, because we employ literally maintainers to Ruby gems, so they know a lot about Ruby gems. So security team aiming end to end with domain experts in particular package ecosystems for best practices, etc. They're making the tough decisions as to what dependencies to use. We're just kind of trying to steer the entire pipeline and offer guidance to those subject matter expert teams as best as we can.
Yeah, that's great. Kim, I have a question specifically for you. So Chainguard recently partnered with OpenSSF and the Eclipse and Rust Foundations for the Salsa++ survey, I believe is what it's called.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Which was looking at adoption of software supply chain best practices within development teams. I think you had nearly 170 respondents, both large and small organizations. I was wondering if you could share a little bit some of the key takeaways or insights from that survey.
Oh man, you're calling me you're calling me out for not having all the details in front of me of the survey. But let me go back to what Salsa is. I mentioned it before. As a open source community led project in the Open Source Security Foundation, Software Security Foundation, which is a project under the Linux Foundation. It has a set of requirements. So it goes from like Salsa level 1 up to Salsa level 4, I believe. And so it focuses on specific areas of the software supply chain. So like the source code in general, the build system, there's a heavy part on just build system kind of requirements, and then kind of common security controls. So what we've seen with the Salsa framework is it's kind of like it's helping give a roadmap to some organizations. So they're like, we want to do better with software supply chain security. Let's see if we can make Salsa like a priority for us and reach the SALSA levels. So like SALSA level 1 might be the first goal, for example, and it has requirements in there like code must be stored in a source repository system, which sounds, simple enough, but you would be surprised that that's not always the case. And then it works up in more requirements as you get to the higher levels and more secure. And so we did send a survey out to try to assess, we and other folks to try to assess where folks are on like the SALSA framework. And I think it was really interesting results. We saw things like a lot of organizations are practicing 2-person review. So that means as a developer, if I write code and I submit it, like someone else has to review my code before we push it into production systems. I think provenance was a little bit lower. This means like actually logging and having all the information available for like where the software came from, how it was built, like it's basically its path along the entire way. So that was a little bit lower on the survey results. And a build service, I think most organizations we're seeing are using like a centralized build service today. But where we're still seeing gaps is many times that those build systems that organizations are using to build their software don't have the same security constraints as like their production systems. And so they're not watching those systems as heavily as what's happening in production, even though they're a critical piece to like this whole story. But at least, people are using more build system type stuff today, whether that's a desktop or a Jenkins server under their desktop, like unknown. So those are some of the insights we saw out of that survey. I don't know if Peter filled it out or Jerome or they found you all.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. Just to
I did not. I apologize, Allison. I was gonna say I didn't, but I would love to see those results. Like, that's something that would be fun to nerd out on.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Kim, you mentioned what SALSA is. The website for SALSA is slsa.dev. And I assume somewhere on there you can find the results to that survey. It's a great place to go. And the standard just went to the 1.0 version here in the past 6 weeks or so, I believe. So definitely check out SALSA as a good guideline when you're starting to think about software supply chain security.
I just pasted the survey, not that anyone listening can see my link, but maybe we add it afterwards.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit, Kim mentioned vulnerabilities when she was talking earlier. So I want to jump into dependency management. It often comes up in discussions around software supply chain, which makes sense since an upwards of 80% of the software organizations rely on is open source. Adoption of open source software has allowed for the acceleration of development and is not going away anytime soon. So the question I would have to kick this off is, within your organizations, how do you communicate with development teams and stakeholders about the risks and benefits of third-party dependencies?
I could jump in with some ideas. So a lot of what we do just leverages GitHub tooling. The fact that there is a DICE security vulnerability alert thing that will show up on repositories for you. Developers see that, they understand what it means. That works great. Another thing we're leaning on is not quite a report card for saying, here's what we think of your new version of a dependency. We're aiming for more of a traffic light metaphor. So not your score is 90 out of 100, but here are the yellow things that you might be worried about before using this dependency. Here are the red things you should not use this dependency. That's how we're aiming to communicate for when new dependencies enter the system, what we think about them and if they should be adopted or not.
And Peter, it sounds like you're trying to deliver that information to the developers where they are and where they're operating.
Yep, absolutely. Just like the GitHub tooling, ideally we're catching things in the pull request. So when someone proposes a new dependency, we'll pop in and say, you know what, we don't think this might be the best dependency for you to be using, or all systems go ahead and merge this.
That's great.
Jerome or Kim, anything to add around how you help educate developers or stakeholders on third-party dependencies and what they mean for software supply chain risk?
I think one thing, it's not out in the market yet, or there are a few companies that have it, but Microsoft Copilot for security is a thing that I've been looking at and studying. That's it's a great tool to help simplifying the complexities, catching what other engineers might miss, and just addressing the holes in your game, right? So it's another tool that's out there, that's coming out there that we are using. I believe we're using it internally, but it's a great resource to help us as a parent with GitHub tooling, right? Using GitHub Actions and GitHub tooling to make those connections, and especially if you're like some of the teams I've been on that are using GitHub for one thing and then Azure DevOps for another thing, and it's everywhere. You're just connecting the dots, and like this is how we're planning this out. So I think that's going to be a really big tool in the next 5 years, what people are going to be using. Especially, I'm just excited because I use a lot of AI in my work, so I'm excited in AI usage in general when it comes to all of the holes of our games. Particularly when it's security and keeping up with keeping these SBOMs updated. One day, someone's going to figure out how to pull the actions that have the alerts go off on GitHub, and then we're going to be turning around. The SBOM's going to be updated automatically, or when there's a big security breach in open source component or a third-party tooling or resource that we're using, that stuff's all going to be done automatically. You're going to get the text message so on your phone, like PagerDuty, like back in the day, or I guess today people still do PagerDuty. I haven't had to do that in a while. I'm grateful. I'm very grateful for not having been on PagerDuty. But yeah, so those are like that. I'm really seeing not just Microsoft, but Google. I'm seeing a few companies really pull the trigger of using generative AI to try to solve the not solve it, but help assist the cloud security engineers, experts with their work. So that's something that I'm very excited to see develop more in the future.
Yeah. Peter, you touched a little bit on scorecards and then yellow or red for the dependency. What are some of the criteria that Shopify looks at to determine if a dependency should have a certain should be categorized as a risky dependency for your developers to use? Have you started to get into what that algorithm or those decision criteria are to help make that to help provide that information to your developers?
Yep, absolutely. So the first and easiest thing is OpenSSF scorecards. If you end up with visibility into branch protection, if you end up with the fact that, as Kim alluded to, people are reviewing code before it gets shipped into a release, these are good signals. We like this. Another one is if the repository has a security policy. So if something goes wrong, there is actually a process for you to follow instead of just opening up an issue saying, your code is bad, please fix it. We are also doing our own static analysis. So we're building our own library of semgrep rules to run on incoming dependencies. I think Datadog is doing a good job here. They have a tool called GuardDog, which is spectacular. We're kind of stealing a lot of their rules and porting them to Ruby because they are not looking at Ruby as much as Shopify is. We're doing a little bit of dynamic inspection too. If we know that there's a specific environment that code will be running in, then we'll try to run that code in the environment, watch what it's doing. And if it starts making unexpected network calls, then we throw up a red flag and say, oh my, this is making unexpected network calls. Because we're mostly afraid about people stealing our environment variables. That's the biggest risk that we face or are worried about.
Jerome, you look like you wanted to hop in there for a second.
I was just going to tell Peter that there is no such thing as stealing in technology, only acquiring. So you're acquiring things that Datadog is doing and putting them into your own systems. Yeah, that's a security forces wordplay that I picked up while in the military. For us, for me, the processes of how I'm doing those scorecards and things like that. There are several things that Peter said that I totally agree with. Making sure branch protection. There's multiple factor authentication that's going on. We're reviewing. People have been reviewing work. We're seeing. I'm looking for discussions I'm trying to see, are there conversations? Are people working to provide clarity around their security policies? I'm looking for monitoring and logging activities. I'm looking for best practices on like how they are doing these security and building in the deployment processes, right? So, and I'm looking at like their patch histories, right? So these are all things that I'm looking at when I'm trying to score a thing to use, as well as, a lot of, I mean, the harsh reality is a lot of the good things come from word of mouth. So we are always looking at community trust as well, right? Like, one of the biggest things the reason Peter probably first heard of Datadog was another expert told him about Datadog's guard dog, and then he checked it out and then he graded it, and he was like, oh, this is good stuff, I'm going to acquire some other things from them, right? So like those are all parts that play into making that scorecard of like, what do we use, right? So
Yeah, that's great. And Peter, thanks for bringing up the OpenSSF scorecard. So that's another example of a standard coming in to help teams as they're making decisions and guide them on their software supply chain journey. We hear about folks who are trying to implement a zero CVE strategy or a zero critical CVE strategy. Is that the right approach for organizations when they're thinking about vulnerabilities, or how should they think about risk and approaching remediation around vulnerabilities?
We think it is. So I mean, it's one of our core products. It's a Chainguard image product, is hardened container images that try to reach zero CVEs and do in most cases. So yeah, we as a company think that if there is a known vulnerability and it's potentially exploitable, that we think getting rid of and fixing that vulnerability or patching it is sort of the best practice. So. And I started that scorecards project, so that was really exciting to hear that it's picking up momentum. The one thing I wanted to add, sorry, just to circle back on that, is for folks listening, is they do maintain a database with the scores. So if you just want to look up an open source project, there's an API that you can ping really quick and get back the results. I don't know if that's how you're using it, Peter, but
we need to share a link to that as well. Yeah.
Kim, you mentioned exploitable in there. Can you help educate the audience a little bit on what exploitable means and different tools or ways to understand if vulnerabilities are exploitable?
I mean, I would hope that it's a vulnerability and is received a CVE as in the vulnerability database, because there is a known vulnerability that's potentially a place in the code where it can be exploited by an attacker that knows how to look for the right thing. So yeah, if you do the right thing or use the right variables or use the right dependency or call the right code path, then there's a chance that this thing can be exploitable and potentially acquire and passwords. What were we just saying, Peter? Stealing versus my jokes are falling flat.
I think it was acquiring was the term Jerome introduced us to.
That was me.
Okay, great. So switching gears a little bit to balancing agility and security. Within your organizations, how do you think about balancing the need for speed and agility in software development with the need for security and risk management of the software supply chain?
I mean, I think most of us all would agree that, safety first, right? Like in the end, especially when you're thinking about how it's when you think of like Microsoft or Shopify, the amount of businesses that are depending on you to be safe before you're being innovative. I think that speaks volumes on like how you have to, treat being agile, right? You can only move so fast, because the first responsibility we have to our customers, and like, yeah, they want cool things, but they also want to make sure that the things that they're dependent on and they've been dependent on work still, right? So for me, in the military, we have this term called slow is smooth, smooth is fast, and that is how I believe that when you're at larger scale companies, you should move and you should think, right? Like, okay, innovation and being fast and being first is great, but if you go over here and you break something, and guess what? All your customers' credit cards are on the web. No one cares how innovative you are because you just helped like black hat hackers acquire all of your your customers' information. Like, good job, right? So like that's the philosophy that I take. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast when it comes to making sure that, like I said, especially it might not be the same for all types of organizations, but companies like, where people are depending on putting their livelihood in those products, I wholeheartedly believe that you should be, security first, agility, as if you're doing everything right and people get better with the security practices and SPOS, things of that nature, the speed will come, right? But you have to put the most important parts of the work first.
Peter, Kim, anything to add there?
I would add tiers of control are very useful. At Shopify, the systems that process credit cards are obviously more protected than everything else. They move slower by design. That's awesome. But like someone who just wants to experiment with a new product or some new service that they want to try out, we want to stay out of their way and let them innovate, let the individual developer do things, because the risk of that ending up in the credit card processing environment is pretty low. So we certainly don't want to lock everything down, but there are very, very important systems that we do want to lock down very securely. So,
yeah, I think this is the natural tension we've seen since forever between security teams and development teams. Developers want to go fast, security teams want to pump on the brakes, and there has to be a balance between the two. This is something that we take to heart at my company. Our mission is to try to make it all secure by default, which means, the more we can do that developers that don't get in developers' way, to help them do the right thing, because we know developers do want to do the right thing, that the better position we can all be in. So we've started, I don't know if we want to get into Wolfie now. Wolfie is a open source Linux undistribution that we designed over at Chainguard for containerized applications. So basically starting all the way down to the OS level to help kind of get developers on the right foundation for being more secure.
Yeah, so
I don't know what developers you've met in your career. I know some cowboys. Hell, I was a cowboy at one point in time. So that is very funny. You're like, oh, developers want to do the right thing. I have a board member who literally like switched. You guys might know him, Brian Holt. He literally rebuilt Reddit GIFs in React without telling anybody at work, and then just left for the weekend, and then people came back. And I have some real cowboys. Like, we've all grown up now, but back in the day we were not. You know what, we all should have been fired, like, in everything we've done. So like that's like, no, we're adults now, but back then I know some cowboys. So I'm very shocked that you don't know as many cowboys as I know.
I do, but I think, given a choice, do you want this more secure thing here or this less secure thing here? Like, the developer is going to make the right choice if they're doing the same thing and not getting in their way or slowing things down.
Your hope and your trust in developers is,
Well,
I wish I could walk around with that type of confidence in developers. Like, oh God, like you just sleep so well at night. Like, man.
Well, Copilot's gonna save us all. So
yeah, I was gonna say, it sounds like we've talked a little bit about putting in the guardrails to help those developers here make those good choices. But it is an interesting point, right? It's really easy to show the flashy new product or feature that you've shipped and to talk about metrics around development speed and things like that. But how do you measure, or what are the metrics that organizations should think about when they're thinking about software supply chain security? It's hard to say, oh, well, we prevented a SolarWind from happening here. But how should organizations think about metrics and the value of security within their organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. I touched on it a little bit earlier. From like the SALSA framework is like one area where you set a goal for yourself. We want everything first party to achieve SALSA level 1 by the end of the year. And that's a very quantifiable metric that organizations could use to help direct their resources. I think like the scorecards project is another one that's very quantifiable if you want to take an aggregation or something. I think what other yeah, I'll stop there for now. I'm sure some other things will come to mind as we keep talking, but I do believe there are ways to measure this and to make sure you're on the right path.
I think our team cares a lot about time to mitigate as a metric. So new vulnerable version comes out, patch is available. How long does it take to make that patch deployed everywhere on the fleet? We want that number to be low and keep going down. And if we keep getting lower and lower, then we're happier and happier. So that's probably the key metric for us.
Yeah. That's a great point. You do all you can to be secure. You're never going to be 100% there, but then if you can remediate and mitigate as fast as you can, then that's like the best you can do, really.
I 100% agree. I was on a team that was very similar. One of our key metrics was making those seconds go down and mitigation of vulnerabilities or problems that would happen within things we were working in. So I think that's a very important, because like you said, you can't ask for perfection, you can only ask for progress. So, seeing, the year-over-year progress over teams or even quarterly, that is, I think that's the biggest, one of the biggest indicators that you're going towards the right direction.
Yeah, that's great. So it's interesting. We've got a lot of large organizations represented here with Microsoft, and then Kim, your background at Google. And actually, SLSA and a lot of these standards have come out of practices that have been implemented at Google for a while. I'm curious, when you think about smaller organizations who maybe are just hearing about software supply chain and SLSA for the first time in the past 6 months, how should they start their journey on software supply chain? Where should they begin? What are the best practices they should consider? What would you recommend to them?
Yeah, great. Oh, Jerome, do you want to go first?
Ladies first. You can always.
Yeah, the way part of this was inspired from being back at Google, but the way I look at the journey is it's really simple. It's 3 steps. It's know, fix, and force. So it's know what you're running. So you start there. If you don't know what's going on in your production systems, you need to start learning. You need to figure out where your software is coming from, how it's been built, where it is in your production workloads. And then once you have a good handle on, where things are, how risky it is, then you can start fixing. You can start making improvements. And then, once you've made improvements, then the ultimate thing is you need to start enforcing things along the entire kind of shifting left as far as you can. But, if you're checking for vulnerabilities or checking for risky dependencies at develop time, you need to make sure that those risky dependencies aren't being reintroduced further along in the supply chain. So that's how I think about it. No, fix, and force.
Yeah, that's great. Jerome?
She essentially said one of the things that I was going to say, like knowing what is in your product. Yeah, like I gave you the floor.
Reinforcement is good.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's the first place a smaller org can start, just knowing what is in their stacks, knowing the tools and resources and products that they're using is very low-hanging fruit for a smaller org to be able to start that process. So I think that's, as a small organization, that'd be the first place I would start, right? So.
And Peter, does that align with how Shopify started their journey, or how would you recommend organizations start to think about software supply chain who aren't already doing some of these practices today?
I think a red flag to throw is the number of ecosystems and tools you want to use in building your products. If you hire a Rails expert and they build you a Rails application and then they leave and someone else builds you an Express application, you now need to worry about dependencies in the Ruby ecosystem as well as the NPM ecosystem. So if you're starting from scratch, maybe try to stay in one ecosystem for as long as you can, or make a very conscious decision about when you're leaving that ecosystem for something else. That's the Shopify problem, is we have a lot of different ecosystems going on. So my job is fun.
Yeah, that's great. So I'd be curious, we talked a little bit about for new organizations starting, for your organizations and where you are today, what are some of the challenges or things that still are hard when it comes to software supply chain security?
I've talked to many large organizations now. I don't work at one yet. We're growing. We're still a very tiny startup. Is around vulnerability management. We've talked about it a bit here today, but the number of resources that companies are putting on just dealing with vulnerabilities is just a little bit mind-blowing. And it's mind-blowing too in the sense that like a new vulnerability comes out and every single company is having to go through the same sort of toil and process to figure out how they're going to handle and what they're going to do about that vulnerability. So we see, we did a survey recently. I don't think we published the results yet, but it's like 20% of an engineer's time or so is like being spent just dealing with vulnerabilities and stuff that they've written. So I think that's still a huge gap.
Peter, Jerome, any challenges or things that keep you up at night when it comes to software supply chain at your organizations?
I'm negative within my team, like I said, because a lot of things we're building are newer and more R&D prepping to go into production. We get to implement the best practices early on, and those teams that we're working with, they tend to trust us, and that's one part of it. And I right now I have zero complaints with the products and teams, because in the organization I work with in Microsoft is ISE, so we work across the board with like larger with like the top 50 clients of Azure, and we're helping them build things that they either want to bring to market or not, or bring to market in other countries, other stuff like that. And we're able to add and implement those like security practices very early on. So I don't have the headaches that Peter has. So although there's nothing in the wild that keeps me up at night.
And Peter?
I'd say coordination. If you look at the wonderful supply chain map on the salsa.dev site, it'll go A to G, I think, for what a typical supply chain looks like. In a company, the build system might be run by one team, and the tooling for development committing might be run by another team. So getting all of those people on the same page, aligned to the same standards, is not a problem that I think is going to get easier anytime soon.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we'll wrap it up there. I want to thank you all for taking some time out of your day to talk about software supply chain best practices. I also wanted to just run through quickly some of the resources we mentioned. So we talked a little bit about SBOMs, with which Jerome helpfully reminded us means software bill of materials. We talked a little bit about SigStore, which helps with signing code and making that whole process a lot easier for organizations. We also mentioned OpenSSF, which is the Open Source Security Foundation. They have a lot of great resources to help organizations as they're thinking about securing open source software. And I think those were, and open source software scorecard. So that's an OpenSSF project around helping score dependencies and using that information to make better choices around your software supply chain. I also wanted to note that we did a webinar a few weeks back, which you can find on the Cloudsmith YouTube, with David Wheeler and Isaac Hepworth talking about Salsa. And so they go through a little bit on what those best practices are. So that's a good resource to check out as well. And then coming up here in Unpacked, we'll have a session on SBOMs with Josh Brothers. So check that out too.